My name is David Bryant. I'm the library director. I'd like to remind you that today's program, as all of our programs are, is privately funded. Yes, we're generously supported by the city, but we are almost as generously supported by private individuals for programming, and all the books you borrow and DVDs you borrow. All of those items come from private contributions. So making a contribution to the Rancho Mirage Public Library Foundation is a good idea. That's the end of the sales pitch. But for those of you who haven't, I hope you really enjoy this program, learn a lot, and feel very guilty. Today's talk is New Initiatives for Restoring the Salton Sea. The Salton Sea is one of our region's most notable natural features and plays host to over 400 species of birds. The Salton Sea, a popular tourist destination in the 50s and I think early 60s, with its seaside homes, prime fishing, and water sports, is now the subject of much concern to Southern California residents. Today, the sea is deteriorating as it is drying up at an alarming rate. Today, we will learn about the new initiatives for restoring the Salton Sea. Professor Tim Krantz holds a PhD from the University of California-Berkeley and is a professor of environmental study at the University of Redlands. Dr. Krantz is a recognized authority on the Salton Sea, where he has served as the Salton Sea Database Program Director for 8 years, overseeing a $4.7 million federal assistance grant to develop a regional geographic database for the area. I want to thank Dustin Ingham for handling the production of today's program, and to Susan Cook, Principal Librarian, for booking Dr. Krantz. Now, please join me in giving Tim Krantz a Rancho Mirage welcome.
Thank you, David. Wow, it's good to see a full house, and thank you, David, for this marvelous facility. This is really quite a gem. And I have been involved with the Salton Sea for not 8 years, but 18 years as the Salton Sea Database Program Director. And so I've seen it go through some significant changes since that time. It's almost doubled in its salinity in those few short years. And I recall when orangemouth corvina could be fished out of the sea, big 30-pounders, until they finally hit their salt tolerance limit in around 2003 or so. Anyway, of this audience, how many of you have actually been down to the Salton Sea before? Most of you. That's spectacular. That's really great. It's always shocking to me to talk to people and understand that they don't have a clue as to where the Salton Sea is or what a marvelous resource it is. If they have heard about it, they've heard that, oh, it's polluted and it's you can't swim in it, and I'm living proof that you can, and in fact, it's quite easy to swim on. So with the salinity. So you can just sit there and twiddle your thumbs. You don't even need to paddle. Okay, with that, I think I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about some of the new and exciting initiatives that are taking place. Just in the last year or two, there have been some pretty exciting new things that are taking place, and other projects that are in the works on a pilot scale. So I'll talk to you about those, but first I need to back up and give you a little background about the Salton Sea itself and its basic geography. So the sea is California's largest lake at about 370 square miles, 35 miles long and about 12 to 15 miles wide, yet only 51 feet deep. That's like a football field full of water, only 1 inch deep. That renders it super sensitive to even slight changes of inflow as to where the shoreline will be. And so with pending potential contractions of sea level as a result of reduced inflows, that is the problem. The sea sits in a closed basin. That is, there's no outlet to the ocean. So the Salton Basin itself comprises this entire area. Here's the Coachella Valley, and Rancho Mirage is somewhere right up here. The Imperial Valley on the south end, bounded on the east by the Chocolate Mountains, Algodones Dunes, Imperial Valley, the US-Mexico border. Interestingly, one of the only places on Earth where you can see a straight line border from space by the greenness on our side and the relative lack of greenness on the Mexicali side of the border, because we get the water first. Bounded on the west side by the peninsular mountain ranges, Mount San Jacinto, the Santa Rosa Mountains. And you can see San Diego over here along the coast and up towards Palos Verdes and Los Angeles to the north there. The sea, when I first got involved 18 years ago, was really known more for its fish and wildlife than anything else. It is truly quite a spectacle in that regard. I'm a biologist, botanist, ornithologist by first profession, and so I was quite taken by the incredible biodiversity of the Salton Sea. As we've coordinated various investigations on the Salton Sea over this period of time, the scientists have discovered more than 400 species of plankton, zooplankton, phytoplankton living in the sea itself. 10% of those were completely new to science. That supports a food chain which begins with the lowly pileworm down here in this lower corner. Pileworms feed on the detritus and all the organic matter falling to the bottom of the sea, and they convert that into nutrients. Here's some barnacles. If you've been down to the sea, you've noticed that the beach is composed not of sand, but of barnacles and bones. These barnacles are a unique subspecies found only in the Salton Sea. They were imported to the sea on the hulls of naval vessels during amphibious war games and practices during World War II. And so they brought in ships from San Diego, and then they did their practices for the D-Day invasion on the beaches of France. On the hulls of those naval vessels were barnacles. The barnacles spawned into the Salton Sea and, isolated from other barnacles in the open oceans, have evolved in such a short time to become a unique subspecies, the Balanus amphitrite saltonensis. But I digress. So this supports this incredible food chain of pileworms to fish that eat pileworms, to birds that eat fish that eat pileworms. And for many of these species, the Salton Sea provides a critical winter refuge for them. 85% of the world's white pelicans winter at the Salton Sea. 90% of the North American eared grebes winter at the Salton Sea. They used to come up and down the coast, and there were wetlands elsewhere that would provide them sustenance along the migratory flyways, but no longer. Most of those are now developed in the Central Valley of California or elsewhere. So the Salton Sea provides a critical winter stopover for many of these species, unrivaled in the rest of the continental United States by its biodiversity in terms of birds. We know of the Salton Sea as supporting, certainly during its heyday, more than 200,000 visitors a year. Back in the 50s and 60s, it hosted more annual visitors than Yosemite National Park. Around its shores in Coachella Valley and Imperial Valley are literally America's winter breadbasket. If you buy a tomato in a New York restaurant, have a tomato on your plate, chances are it was grown in the Imperial Valley because we have a 4-season climate there, right, that never freezes. So they can produce much in the way of produce for the rest of the United States during these times. Altogether, about a $2 billion agricultural industry, but also very well known. In fact, I think I'm in this picture somewhere. But spectacular for bird watching, and the sunsets from the east shore of the Salton Sea are unrivaled. They are certainly, I think, the best on the planet. When you get that glassy stillness, kind of a silvery, mercurial color off the water with the setting sun on the opposing western bank and the silhouetted black mountains behind it. It's just spectacular. A little bit about the Salton Sea hydrology to understand this. Again, it sits in a closed basin. That is, there's no outlet to the ocean. So all the water that drains into the sea, altogether about 1.3 million acre-feet of water a year, drains into the sea, carrying dissolved salts. The water evaporates away, leaving the salts behind. Hence, the Salton Sea becomes saltier and saltier each year, to the tune of about 4 million tons of salt each year coming into the Salton Sea basin. Of that water, almost all of it is ag runoff. As you can see on the pie chart above us, 45% of that water, or actually 77%, is coming in the New and Alamo River channels in the Imperial Valley. Only 8%, 7% here, comes from the whitewater drainage, that is the Coachella Valley. 8% from ag drains that drain directly into the sea. So altogether, that's 93% of the inflow is from ag runoff. Only 3% or so from rainfall itself. So that comprises the inflow, and it drains into the sea, again, primarily from the south. And at its high stand, 227 feet below sea level, at its high stand, evaporation equals inflow at about 1.3 million acre-feet a year. 1.3 million acre-feet in, 1.3 million acre-feet to the atmosphere. And it's stable, but getting saltier and saltier. This was an interesting graphic that was prepared in the LA Times last fall in a series of articles that they did. And as I mentioned, the sea is so shallow, so large and huge, and yet only 50 some odd feet deep, that even slight reductions of inflow have huge consequences on where the shoreline will reside. In this case, we're looking at mandatory, these are US Supreme Court adjudicated reductions of inflow from a water policy called the Quantification Settlement Agreement. What it is there's a law of the river. Almost all this water, mind you, comes from the Colorado River. And the law of the river says that each state has so much of water that they can withdraw. California had been withdrawing more than their share for many decades. The other states didn't have the infrastructure to do that. But now that Arizona has their own Arizona Central Canal, and Las Vegas has developed delivery systems to support southern Nevada, and so on, these states then sued California for taking more than its allocation. And by some arcane politic, they arrived at this quantification settlement agreement that says, okay, California, you've got to reduce your draw from the river by 300,000 acre-feet. Commencing in 1918, so just January 1st, or 2018, January 1st, we'll start to turn the tap off to the tune of 15,000 acre-feet per year. No, it's 20,000 acre-feet per year over 15 years cumulatively. So that after 15 years, we'll have 300,000 less acre-feet of water going into the Salton Sea. How this helps balance the water budget in the Colorado River, I have no idea. The water politics is not necessarily a rational thing. As Mark Twain said, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting over. And indeed, that's the case here. So Suffice to say that in 2018, waters will begin to be reduced. And you can see here, the elevation will drop from its high stand at 227 and annually will recede, and the shoreline recedes as well. So this is the surface elevation, and at its bottom, it's 252 feet below sea level, right? So it's dropped about 25 feet in total depth. That's about half of the total depth of the sea, all right? And we're starting at already at minus 235. That's where the Imperial Irrigation District is mandated to maintain the sea until 2018, and then it retracts. As you can see, it retracts most on the south and east shores. This is where it's shallowest, and so the bathymetry draws down as much as 5 to 7 miles here. Also at Salton City, you can see it's going out at least 1.5 miles or so. And the Whitewater River Delta up our way also will experience huge contractions as the sea recedes. This is a graphic that shows where the sea will be based on the mandated reduction of 300,000 acre feet, right? That would be this line here. It's kind of hard to see. It's kind of a amber colored line, all right? That's 300,000 acre foot reduction here from here. And that will draw the lake down to a surface elevation of minus 246 below sea level, and that exposes about 85 square miles of lake bottom sediments, okay? But I've also modeled here a 500,000 acre foot drawdown. 500,000 acre feet is what we're really expecting to happen. This is a result of not just those mandated reductions of inflow from agriculture, but also other water transfers, Mexicali wastewater treatment. Mexicali put online, mind you, that's a city of 1.5 million people, put online a wastewater treatment plant. They used to just dump their untreated wastewater, not a good thing, into the New River, which would drain into the Salton Sea. They put online a wastewater treatment plant in 2000 or so, and now they keep their gray water and they use it on agriculture and things. That's a good thing. But it's less water into the sea, another 50, 60,000 acre feet. Salinity control in the fields and other measures may also reduce some of this inflow. Canal lining along the All-American Canal and the Coachella Canal. These canals used to leak a lot of water back through their unlined canals. That water would end up in the sea, but now that those are lined, which is a good thing, it still means less water into the sea. So altogether, we're expecting about 500,000 acre feet of reduction of inflows from 1.3 million, down 500,000 acre feet. That will expose huge areas. This is our red line inside the middle. Altogether, about 90,000 acres. That is 140 square miles of lake bottom sediments. As the sea contracts, all of the salt that's already in residence in the sea will become more and more concentrated. And so the rise of salinity will be exponential. And as that salinity goes up, the fish will hit their salinity tolerance. Already we've lost all but 2 species of fish in the Salton Sea. The only native fish is the desert pupfish. It's federally endangered. And it will be the last one surviving. It's used to swimming in hypersaline waters during the prehistoric Lake Cahuilla stands, which would get very salty. But also its refuge when the Salton Sea would dry out completely would be up in freshwater springs in Anza Borrego State Park or over towards Dos Palmas Oasis in Salt Creek on the east side of the Salton Sea. Suffice to say that even they will reach a salinity limit where the fishery will collapse. The other fish species in the sea today, mind you, is this introduced tilapia. Tilapia is not a native fish. They're native to the East African lakes. It's a cichlid. They escaped from aquaculture farms in the early 1960s or so, and from a very small starter population, adapted to brackish water with ever so slightly increasing salinity over that past 50 years or so, they've become adapted to hypersaline water that's today 50% saltier than the ocean. So I call them the mutant Salton Sea tilapia. They're survivors indeed. It's still a good fish for, you'll find them on your restaurant plate. And people do still fish them out of the Salton Sea in great numbers. There's estimated 40 million fish or so still in the Salton Sea. But when they do hit their salt limit, and I would say that that's probably in the next couple of years, you'll have 40 million dead fish. You think that big stink a couple years ago was bad? This will really be something. So anyway, we'll have the fishery collapse. Anything that's dependent on those fishery, like those pelicans, will have to find someplace else to go. And so we expect that the bird populations will also have to move on. If we kind of zoom in on a couple of these places at the Salton Sea, here we are at the South Shore again, and it's misleading when you look at the whole sea from a satellite view because it's so large. But when we see on the bottom here, you can see that with the 300,000 acre-foot drawdown, the sea recedes 3.8 miles from the South Shore. This is right where the Sonny Bono Salton Sea National Wildlife Refuge and all of the sensitive resources are. Down along the South Shore would be very much high and dry. And then with further reductions of the sea, minus 500,000 acre-feet, you can see it recedes greatly, altogether almost 6 miles out. Other areas like Salton City would also be exposed. Norm Niver, one of our stalwart Salton Sea supporters, just passed away not long ago, but from his dock, I used to enjoy a good margarita after a hot afternoon working down there, and his dock it's now almost a half a mile out from his dock to get to the water. And so this will expose huge areas of mud flats and these lake bottom sediments. In about 2003, I'll take credit for kind of raising the specter of what happens when we expose all those lake bed sediments. As the Salton Sea Database Program Director, we called in experts from Owens Dry Lake, up on the southeast side of the Sierra Nevadas, where the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power has dewatered what used to be a large inland kind of brackish saline water lake there, and completely exposed it, such that today Owens Dry Lake, here's some dust storms. Let's see, I guess, yeah, that's there. The Owens Dry Lake comprises about 28,000 acres of dusty emissive sediments. These are very fine sediments, PM10 or PM2.5. That is particulate matter that's as small as 2.5 microns, millionths of a meter in diameter. I can get 30 particles in the width of a human hair, 50,000 particles in the space of a sugar cube. They're so small that if you ingest these particles into your lungs, they perfuse directly into your bloodstream, carrying with them nasty chemicals like arsenic and cadmium. And so the prospect of, and this is up at Owens Dry Lake, 28,000 acres, we could look at 3 or 4 times that exposure here. Owens Dry Lake, they have perhaps a couple hundred people that live around in the valley, Owens Valley. And here we're talking about 1.5 million people. So I did anticipate this slide a bit. But so this is on top of a baseline respiratory health condition in Imperial Valley that's 4 times as bad as any other county in California. It's because of these superfine sediments that were laid down by the ancient Lake Cahuilla that used to fill up this valley. And it acted like a sieve such that heavy particles would fall out near the shore, and the very, very fine particles that would float would go out further and then settle onto the lake bed. But now we're going to expose those superfine sediments. Once airborne, they'll travel hundreds of miles. Now, the prevailing winds will carry these particles from here towards Phoenix. So this is definitely an interstate problem. But you all know that occasionally the wind will turn around. You get what's called a chubasco that comes from the southeast side of the Salton Basin, blows up this direction. And those particles will be affecting people here in Coachella Valley, or all the way to Los Angeles, depending on which way the wind blows. So it's not just a problem. Many people say, well, it's just a problem down there in southeastern California. But it's not. It's much bigger than that. It's not just a local regional problem. It's an interstate problem. It's an international problem. So let's talk about some solutions. That's too depressing. In fact, I've been around the block a few times on the solutions sector. We've considered, you name it. I get all these kind of wild-eyed ideas, everything from building floating islands in the middle with casinos on them. That's an interesting one. Mind you, the Torres Martinez tribe owns a checkerboard pattern of the lake bottom. The Great White Father gave them the worthless lake bed during the late 1800s. But now they own a checkerboard of the parcels under the north part of the lake. So conceivably, one could have a floating casino out there. It'd be kind of interesting. Other ideas include things like taking the salt water out and using substantial amounts of energy, desalinating that, and creating fresh water. Of course, if we're going to spend that much energy to make fresh water, it's not likely to be just put back into the sea, is it? And so we've looked at desalination projects. This one down here was giant snowblowers. We're going to take snowblowers, it's called enhanced evaporation systems, and we're going to take the hypersaline water out of the sea and vaporize it into the atmosphere and remove the salt. You can't sell this salt. It's not like table salt, sodium chloride. It's got other chemicals in it, so it's not good table salt. But we actually evaluated this. This was a full-blown technical evaluation. There are fallowing of fields was one idea, but still that's less water into the sea. Saline ponds to try to take hypersaline water out. Sort of the idea is freshen the rest of the water in the sea by taking out the super concentrated salts. This was one of the better ideas, I think. Technically, it was really doable. In 2005 or so, the state organized an assessment of a range of these different Salton Sea solutions and alternatives. They range from the floating island idea to a bathtub ring around the edge and just let the middle dry out, kind of like a vanishing edge pool with a hollow middle. And just maintain that bathtub ring. Kind of a wacky idea. This one, though, was actually proposed by the Salton Sea Authority, the joint powers agency comprised of the 2 counties, the 2 major water districts, and the Torres Martinez tribe. And this called for creating a half of the sea with half of the inflow, basically. The sea's kind of a figure 8, and it's got 2 deep basins, north and south, and it's across the middle is sort of a shallow isthmus, that's hard to say, isthmus, I don't even have a lisp, and I lisp with that one. And this, so across the middle, it's only about 30 feet deep. Well, now it's about 25 feet deep. And so we would build a dike across the middle. They didn't want to call it a dam. They called it a mid-sea barrier. And so we'd wheel the water up from the New and Alamo River, the larger tributary flows. We come up along the West Salton River. Mind you, I actually conceptualized this on a plan compared to what the Salton Sea Authority did. So I've actually tried to formalize this concept. Bring it up along what I call the West Salton River. Mind you, this river is still a mile or two wide. And let it go into the North Basin. The North Basin is deeper, and it has a steeper shore zone around its edges, so it's less sensitive to inflow out to the changes from variability of inflows, right? So we'd maintain the North Sea, and this is where most of the cities but for Bombay Beach. This is where all the towns are up along this shore, and North Shore up here. And so we'd maintain a stable marine environment of salinity for the North Basin. Mind you, we still have to have a salt discharge, right? Otherwise it's going to get saltier and saltier. So in this case, we have the salt discharged from a siphon. The siphon is drawing from depth where it's saltier in the bottom of the sea than it is fresh water floats on top, right? So we draw from depth back up to slightly above the sea surface, and then it flows by gravity back down into the South Basin. And as it's doing so, it's concentrating salt. So this is our salt sink. This is where the excess salt would go, 4 million tons a year. Mind you, we have to keep this river salty. It can't be fresh because that would support mosquitoes, cattails, other things. You could have West Nile virus, other things. So we maintain this. Some of the salt river then comes back in, recirculates, and we maintain a design salinity of something close to the ocean levels. All right? The South Basin, in the meantime, we could cover with renewable energies systems, geothermal and solar and others that I'll talk to you about in a minute. But this would help cover the middle area and keep it from blowing dust. Plus, by keeping this kind of perimeter wet, any salt that's blowing in, or rather sand particles, that blows in from outside of the sea, say from Anza Borrego sand dunes, these sand particles would get trapped here before they get out on the playa. So we've kind of created a moat that protects this from the sand, which can then cascade and tumble across the lake bed. So this idea, I thought, really has some merit. Technically, we could do this. It does involve, mind you, this is 30 miles by 15 miles. And so it involves at least 50 miles of dikes and canals, plus this mid-sea barrier would be perhaps 20 feet high, very gently sloping, so it's not like a rigid, Hoover Dam, but would be a fill material with lots of dirt. There'd be some major quarrying to do. But huge infrastructure. Altogether, it's estimated to cost perhaps $5 to $7 billion. Chump change compared to the high-speed rail, but and it would serve a lot more people. But in any case, a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project right astride the San Andreas Fault. It could render this project into mud in one significant seismic event. So with that realization, I thought, okay, no, this isn't going to work. We have to look for other solutions. And so that brings us to some of the short-term solutions that the decision makers are looking at now. Include these constructed wetlands. This is on the New River that's coming from Mexicali into the south side of the Salton Sea. Along the New River, we have this kind of serpentine shape, and here's the river itself. And so the river is diverted into the wetlands. They flow through a series of narrow channels here, growing lots of cattails and vegetation and things with the fertilizer-rich water. But what that does is it's removing the nutrients that create the abundant plankton and life in the New River and ultimately in the Salton Sea. So it's kind of cleaning up the nitrates and phosphates that go into the sea. Let me back up and make one point really clear. The Salton Sea is not polluted. It's not polluted at all. If you just took the salt out and the fertilizer components, nitrates and phosphates, it meets Federal Clean Water Act standards for drinking, safe drinking water. How can that be, right? All those pesticides in the fields. It turns out that the pesticides are unmeasurable in the Salton Sea sediments themselves. They're not coming out of the fields. They stick to those fine silt particles in the fields, and it sequesters the pesticides away. So the water itself is not polluted in the industrial sense of pollution, right? It's just super nutrient rich that supports the abundant plankton and life. So it's nutrient rich. This system would help remove some of those excess nitrates and phosphates. There are other wetlands that are planned. This is just approved by the National Wildlife Refuge and the Imperial Irrigation District at the southeast end of the sea. This is the Red Hill Bay Wetlands Restoration Project. And I worked on their environmental assessments to get this pilot project approved. And what we're proposing here is to, if you've been down to this southeast part of the sea, it's the wildlife, bird mecca of the Salton Sea. I could take you down there and park your vehicle on Davis Road in January, February, and you'll see 10, 20,000 snow geese fly over the road. It's a spectacle like you'll see nowhere else. Red Hill is a little volcanic cinder cone that now is completely high and dry. This picture was taken in 2011. Now this is entirely dried out, and the sea is way out here. This is the Alamo River coming in, and it forms a classic sort of birdfoot delta, it's called. And still today, you'll see thousands, tens of thousands of birds on these wetlands right next to Red Hill, including pink flamingos and some really unusual things. So anyway, this project in Red Hill Bay would restore water by bringing in salt water from the receding shore, pumping that up, mixing it with fresh water from the Alamo River, and then discharging it back into a constructed wetlands, constructed using some aggregate material from Red Hill itself to build up these wetlands, and that would be, here's Davis Road, Red Hill, and where we'd scoop up and build these loafing islands, nesting islands for birds, and shallowly inundate this entire area. It's about 450 acres altogether. And so we could restore this to very good ecological values, akin to what it used to support. Just upstream from Red Hill, again, here's Red Hill and the Red Hill Bay Restoration Area, the Alamo River coming out. This was Mullet Island. It was a little cinder cone island. the only island in the Salton Sea, and it was the home for 10,000 brown pelicans that would nest on the island, thousands of cormorants and other birds. These are ocean birds, right? But this is their only inland breeding population in North America. Mullet Island was exposed to the shore a couple of years ago, and coyotes have since found their way out there and decimated the bird populations. So it no longer supports brown pelicans. But just upstream from them, this is Highway 111, in this area, we've got another project called Saline Habitat Ponds. The state, some time ago, towards 2007-8, got $25 million, and they proceeded to hire a bunch of people that I don't even know their names, I've not even met them, who hung out in Sacramento and deliberated on what to do. And they spent half of that money just thinking about projects, and they came up with this, which they estimated would cost, I forget, several millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars. But this is only comprising, this is the model, the pilot scale project. They proposed this for 800 or 900 acres out in the Salton Sea. And that would be to capture the water before it gets down into the Salton Sea itself and run it through a series of baffles, you can see here, down through the system, like through a radiator. And this will support lots of birds, and it'll keep the lake bed sediments down. But that's only, give it 1,000 acres, right? We've got 90,000 to cover. So these are Band-Aids at best, very expensive ones. So even the Red Hill Bay project, it's a great project. I'm all for it. It'll have great wildlife values, but it's not going to solve the problem. The Imperial Irrigation District and Imperial County got together, and recognizing that the sea is going to go down one way or the other, we're going to see some pretty significant reductions before we see any solutions. So they've got together and they created this Salton Sea Restoration and Renewable Energy Initiative. It's a really novel idea that would tap into the abundant renewable energy resources that we have out at the sea and promote their development while receiving some tariffs back from energy production that would support building the infrastructure for a project of some sort and maintaining that project over time to run the pumps, for example. So this measure was passed a little over a year ago. One of those ideas for renewables would be to create more of those new river types of wetlands, but in this case, converting the nutrient-rich flows into biodiesel by cultivating algae. Mind you, the Salton Sea itself is the biggest bioreactor on the planet, right? You've got lots of sunlight, lots of nutrients, grows lots of algae, which feeds lots of fish, right? That's how these biodiesel algae production facilities would work. Back in 2009, 2010, I received a Fulbright scholarship where this is under the Schwarzenegger administration, I received a Fulbright to go to Austria. Governor Schwarzenegger, perhaps the world's most famous Austrian, or infamous, at the time was really taking a leadership role in California and the United States on renewable energies. And so I went to Austria to promote renewable energy technology transfer between the US and the European Union, California and Austria. And we looked at systems like this, and where some of the Austrian technology firms are perhaps a decade ahead of the United States on some of these technologies. For example, on the biodiesel algae, they have these open pond arrays. These were tried. There was a pilot project up here near the Whitewater Delta by Kent Seatech, and Kent Seatech did this where they took the Whitewater River flows, they put them into these ponds, grew lots of algae, but they couldn't really make it economical because you don't want to just grow a bunch of random algae. You need these high glycerin content ones. So perhaps a better idea would be these vertical column algae production facilities like this, where the algae is contained and cultivated inside these tubes, transparent tubes, let sunlight go through. All you need is nutrients, we've got lots of that, and sunlight and carbon dioxide. Turns out carbon dioxide is the stuff that's bubbling up in the mud pots down there. So we've got the perfect setting to grow lots of algae. And so if we did algae arrays, say just around the deltas of the New River and the Alamo River and the Whitewater River deltas, where we're capturing ag runoff, running it through these biodiesel algae production facilities, they take out the nitrates and phosphates and they turn it into biodiesel. You could run your car or a jet engine on this stuff. My Austrian colleagues calculated that this vertical column bioreactors, you could produce 7,000 gallons of biodiesel per acre per year. So if we took, say, 1,000 acres of the deltas, you could produce 7 million gallons of diesel fuel while cleaning up the inflow. So this is a good idea. And I think it's one that still deserves to be further explored through pilot scale studies. Another resource that we have at the Salton Sea is it uniquely sits on perhaps the largest geothermal reservoir in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas. In this case, we've got geothermal energy primarily down around the southeast shore. About 50% of the known geothermal resource area is under the sea, and about 50% right off in the nearshore southern eastern area. Altogether, let's see, we've got about 350 megawatts of geothermal in production already down there. But it's estimated that the total potential resource is on the order of 2.5 gigawatts, that's billion watts of energy. And the beauty of this is, unlike wind and sun, it's 24/7, and it's absolutely clean. 2.5 gigawatts of energy, that's enough to power more than 2.5 million homes. This would power much of the southwestern United States. And not to mention create thousands of good high-tech jobs. One of the other things in the geothermal brine, the way they do that is they sink these wells down and they're bringing up this very super salty water from almost a mile, 2 miles deep. They bring it up, they run it through a heat exchanger, so that heats a thermal fluid that then they can use to convert steam and generate electricity. And then they have to re-inject the brine back down to compensate for that and keep everything down below in balance. But they found that the brine solutions are very high in lithium salts. Well, lithium is the stuff of batteries, right? So, and it's not cheap. Today, most of the world's lithium market comes from the Atacama Desert in the Chilean, Argentinian desert area, or from China. And so we're paying a high price for this to the tune of about $5,000 per ton, and with an ever-increasing need for batteries for, you name it, from your gadgets to your cars to a Tesla. I wish. But at $5,000 per ton, 16,000 tons per 50 megawatt of geothermal energy production. Let's see, so that's $5,000 per ton times 50 megawatts, that's $90 million or so of revenue a year, or times 16,000 tons. And we expect that that could be increased by about 50 times. We're talking about $4.5 billion of revenue just from lithium, in addition to the geothermal. Not to mention the energy security that comes from domestically supplying all the lithium that we need. And of course, you know that we're very much blessed with solar resources out here in the desert. Only about 10 cloudy days a year down at the Salton Sea. When I was on the San Bernardino County Planning Commission back in my late 20s, we approved the largest, what was right up until 2 years ago, the largest solar energy facility on Earth out near Adelanto, called the SEGS, Solar Energy Generating System. And using the latest of the SEGS 9-phase development, the 8th and 9th phases generate a total of about 160 megawatts of energy on just 0.37 square miles. If we took 10 square miles of the lake bed, and the arrays are much more efficient now than they were back in the late 80s, 1990s when this was built. But if we, just using those numbers, if we took 10 square miles of lake bed under photovoltaics, we could generate 4.3 gigawatts of energy again. This on top of the 2.5 gigawatts that we've produced from geothermal. So we're talking about 7-8 gigawatts of power, clean, non-carbon power from the Salton Sea lake bed. That's enough for 8 million homes per year. And these arrays would cover the lake bed, break up the wind fetch. So if there are exposed stretches of lake bed, then it breaks up the wind and could help reduce those catastrophic wind events that might otherwise occur. Unlike the other big industrial solar plants that are being built out in the high desert towards Blythe, or if you've seen the one out at Ivanpah, the big solar collector that reflects all the sunlight up into a big concentrating solar tower, fries anything that flies through it. You have lots of chicken from migratory birds. I mean, it looks like the sun if you look at it. Unlike those facilities, which have impacts on cultural resources, desert intaglios, desert tortoises, and other things, this is absolutely wouldn't harm a bush. And it'd be a lot closer to the users. So we have solar energy potential, huge. We've got another innovative idea called salinity gradient solar ponds. We're just about completed with the environmental assessments to go forward with a pilot project for this on the south shore of the Salton Sea. Salinity gradient solar ponds were first tested on the Dead Sea in Israel by, I'm blanking on the engineering company's name. It's a big international energy company. But the way it works is you have heavy brine and you float fresh water on top of it. And fresh water floats on salt water. So you could take fresh water coming in from the rivers, take heavy brine from out of the Salton Sea itself, and it creates a prism. And so solar energy hits these ponds, penetrates through to the brine layer, heats that brine layer up to almost the boiling temperature. It'll hit up to 180 degrees. And then once it achieves its target temperature, then you cycle the hot water, goes back through a heat exchanger. And Ormat was the engineering company, by the way. And it runs through what's called a Rankine cycle turbine that then takes the heat off of the heavy brine and converts that into steam and runs a generator and creates electricity from waste salt, from heavy salt. Well, we have lots of that. So, and in so doing, once the heat has been taken off, then you run the water back, and it goes back into the heavy brine layer again at the bottom, and now it's lost its heat, and it can recharge itself. So this just cycles the water back and forth through this chamber. Okay, so that's a salinity gradient solar pond. The idea is that we could take this and look at, so our pilot project, we looked at several different sites along the south shore, and we ended up picking this one right next to a geothermal plant down Long Lac Road. And so our idea is to build this salinity gradient solar pond and use the energy from that to run a desalination plant that will create a habitat pond next to it. This would be distilled water, essentially, that we could add a little bit of salt, maintain the salinity at what we want, but it creates habitat. But the major idea is cover the lake bed with these saline habitat or salinity gradient solar ponds as a means of covering the lake bed around the edges. Now, these facilities they don't have to be next to a power plant. They're going to run on their own solar energy once you get them started. You could have these strategically placed out on the lake bed so it breaks up the wind fetch and generates electricity and energy. Altogether, we conceive of these 40-acre pond clusters where you take hot water out of one pond that, say, this is 10-acre pond. You take the hot water off of this one, you're running the heat exchanger, you deplete the heat off of this one, and then you move to the next pond, and then to the next, and the next. Now you're back to the first pond again. And so you can cycle the heat generation off of a series of these ponds and cover expanses of lake bed while generating up to 4 megawatts of power per 40-acre pond. So if we took 4 megawatts of power, that's enough for another 400,000 homes. And so if we did this on just 1,000 acres, again, we're generating 25 megawatts of power, all using waste salt. All of these are good ideas, but they're short-term and they're small. They're covering tens of acres, or perhaps hundreds, up to 1,000 or so, but keep in mind, we've got 90,000 acres to try to take care of. And so, and all of these big infrastructure projects like the mid-sea barriers and things are seismically vulnerable. Furthermore, we can't really rely on the water in the Colorado River to be there either. It's kind of ironic that the states are arguing about water in the river that's not even there. Hoover Dam is at 30% of its capacity. And if this is shades of things to come in terms of climate change and the dewatering and continuing drought of southwestern U.S., then the Colorado River itself is not really a reliable water supply that we can count on. So the only reliable water supply is certainly then the ocean. And in this case, then I'm kind of excited to undertake a new investigation. And you might say, not another study. But in fact, I'd like to further explore these, what I call sea-to-sea connections, connecting the Salton Sea to the Sea of Cortez to the south, or boring through the Peninsular Mountain Range to the coast at Carlsbad, perhaps San Onofre. There's a big power plant there that sits idle, could be run to run the pumps. So these are sea-to-sea alternatives, right? Connect the Salton Sea to the ocean. You have to pump in and out to have that salt discharge back out to the ocean, right? So it's an inflow-outflow type of system. I will say that we have already studied this just cursorily. There was a sea-to-sea engineering kind of back of the envelope panel that we pulled together back around 2003 that looked at this. And we brought in the pipeline companies, and we brought in people from the Aral Sea in Russia and others that have experienced problems like we have at the Salton Sea. And we looked at these sea-to-sea connections. Initially, the first sea-to-sea investigation was actually organized by the late Congressman George Brown, who was the Democratic congressman from the Colton area of the Inland Empire. I love to say that, the Inland Empire. I'm from there. But so the late George Brown contemplated this, and in those days, working across the aisle, Sonny Bono and George Brown got together, and they got this engineering group together, and Metcalf and Eddy, an international energy engineering company, took a look at this. And they looked at a sea-to-sea connection to the Sea of Cortez in open lock lift canals, kind of like the Panama Canal, that would connect down to the Sea of Cortez. You'd have to have an inflow canal and an outflow canal. And they looked at that. Imagine getting on the Love Boat here in, near the Whitewater area in Coachella and sailing down, going through the locks and lifts and down to the Sea of Cortez and around Cabo back up to San Diego. Wouldn't that be romantic? It'd be awesome. I would do that. So anyway, but the Metcalf and Eddy study penciled out in the, $5 to $10 billion range. And at the time, everyone said, who has that kind of money, right? For that matter, most of these projects penciled out in the multiple billion-dollar range, 7 to 10 billion. And that's where they ended, and they sat there. But now we're looking at costs of doing nothing that are estimated at $20 to $70 billion in the next 50 years, just in property damage and lowered property values. But also, it's not just about fish and wildlife anymore, it's about human life and the health impacts to respiratory disease. It's the loss of billions of dollars of agricultural revenue. And very quickly, $5 to $10 billion, okay. That's much better than the cost of doing nothing. So suddenly these ideas have new potential viability in terms of their real feasibility and cost and return on investment. And I think the most promising is certainly C2C. So just recently, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, we made a presentation to state officials to really investigate this idea thoroughly, once and for all. Really look at the technical engineering requirements for doing this. We'll pull all of the best and brightest pipeline engineers and hydrologists and ecologists, a binational team together, lock us all in a room for a week together, and this would be at ESRI, the home of Geographic Information Systems in Redlands. And using their sophisticated geographic scientific tools, we'll look at this route inside out and pencil it out. How much does it cost? And I'm pretty excited about what we might find the answers would be. Certainly less than doing nothing. This is one of those few projects where usually if you, and I do environmental impact assessments professionally in my day job, usually when we do that, the no project alternative, doing nothing, is the most environmentally benign. Not in this case. So we'll examine this, C2C, thoroughly, once and for all, really put a number on it. Thank you. The other aspect that we propose to do is there are many opportunities to add renewable energy generation to this system to run the pumps. Okay, so say we're bringing up water from the Sea of Cortez. And let me just back up and point out that here's the Sea of Cortez down here. And so paralleling Mexicali Valley, and here's Mexicali and the city and all of the agriculture and the Colorado River itself. There's a mountain range, the Cucapá Range, separates Mexicali Valley from the Peninsular Mountain Range up the Laguna Salada. The Laguna Salada is almost as big as the Salton Sea itself, but it's a dry lake bed most of the time. I did get my brand new CRV stuck in it once. But we'd bring water up through the Laguna Salada. It hits its high point here. The drainage divide is only about 50 feet above sea level. So we have to lift that up or even bore through the mountains right here to where you'd only have to lift this to just above sea level. And then it's by gravity feed all the way down into the Salton Sea. If we discharge it into the new river channel itself, we don't even need a pipeline or a canal. We'll just discharge this incoming seawater into the new river, up into the Salton Sea. And then we have to lift Salton seawater back out and back down to the Sea of Cortez. Now, we could put a geothermal plant. Mind you, there's geothermal resources right under this north end of the Laguna Salada, or solar to help do the lift right here. So we pump that up, and we do the pumping up on off-peak hours, and then we let it go down. We can use the Laguna Salada as our holding basin, and we let it fall into the Salton Sea during peak electrical hours, and we harvest the difference in cost between peak off-peak power generation to help pay for running the system. Or we could use geothermal and solar here at the north end, and then as part of a desalination effort on top of the Sea of Cortez water coming in, we desalt that a little bit so that we then let it discharge back down to the sea a little fresher than ocean water. So we get more dilution potential out of that. Mind you, we have to lift that salt water back up. So we pump up on off-peak hours and then discharge back into the Laguna Salada and back out to the Sea of Cortez. If we draw this water from deep in the South Basin, we're drawing super saline water and we get more dilution bang for our buck again. Or the other route would be connecting to Carlsbad or the Pacific Ocean directly. You might think, how do you do that? It's through solid rock and mountains. We've already done that. The California Aqueduct tunnels through the mountains of the San Gabriel Mountains or the San Bernardino Mountains. They have this giant machine called the mole. It's 12 feet in diameter, and it just burrows through mountains like a gopher. Pulls the ore and the dirt and rock back out the back of the tunnel onto train cars for disposal. We could use that same dirt to build dikes and whatever we need for our earthworks. And so this too, even here, is technically feasible. Let's put a cost to it and see what it actually would cost to do that. Compared to $20 to $70 billion for not doing it, suddenly these things make more sense again. You could run a renewable energy transmission corridor in the conduit parallel to the bore for the water, and you'd have an energy transmission corridor for all that geothermal and solar energy that we generate at the Salton Sea to transmit that to the coast without disturbing a bug or a bee on the transmission corridor power line. So these ideas are, I think, deserving of a full technical feasibility study. And with that, I think we really do have some potential solutions, long-term solutions for the Salton Sea. Thank you. Just one more thing. I'll point out here at the bottom, it's a little hard to see for the light, but there's a website, an online atlas. I don't know if you've seen our Salton Sea Atlas. It's a big coffee table book on the Salton Sea with beautiful artwork and what have you. I'll take credit for that. I'm one of the lead senior editors on that project. We've put the atlas, everything you want to know about the Salton Sea, all those 400 studies that have been done are accessible online. So, so check this out. Here's the website. It's www.spatial, as in outer space, spatial.redlands.edu/Salton. Or just look up University of Redlands, Salton Sea, and this will probably pop up. It's an online atlas. It's really fun to navigate. You can check out the various chapters on that that'll tell you all about the biology, the ecology, the hydrology, everything about the Salton Sea. It's all very interactive. So that same graphic that showed the birds is actually an 8-foot wide painting that we have in the atlas, and if you click on the bird, it has the bird call, squawking and doing its thing. So it's really fun to navigate, and you'll learn a lot about the Salton Sea by doing it. So thanks again.